Dr. Robert Jan van Pelt is a world-renowned expert on Auschwitz, one of the Holocaust's most lethal camps. In a high-profile Holocaust denial case tried in the British High Court in 2000, Dr. van Pelt served as an expert witness to present evidence that Auschwitz was an extermination camp, primarily using gas chambers to kill up to 1 million Jews. His latest book, The Case for Auschwitz, Evidence from the Irving Trial, has been described as one of the finest expert witness reports to ever reach publication. Dr. van Pelt, thank you for joining us in The Connection.
Thank you, Pat.
Let's talk about David Irving, since the trial is called the Irving Trial. Who was David Irving? What does he represent?
Who is David Irving? He's very much alive right now. David Irving actually is quite an interesting man, I think. He is I would say, in many ways, a brilliant young man who was a brilliant writer and a historian, a self-taught historian who in the early 60s produced a book on the bombing of Dresden. And in this book, he described the bombing of Dresden by the Allies in 1945 as an Allied war crime. And this gave him access to groups of ex-Nazis, people who had not really been speaking in public since the end of the war, who basically trusted him with their papers. And so Irving got a reputation of being able to get hold of archival stuff no other historian had seen. He started to work on that stuff and came out in 1977 with a book, which is an interesting book, called Hitler's War. In that book, he basically had a rather odd thesis, and that was that Hitler had really not known about the Holocaust, that the Holocaust had happened behind Hitler's back, that it had been created by Himmler, the chief of the SS, and Goebbels, and that Hitler only knew about the Holocaust in late 1943 and was in some way upset about it. To quote Irving, Adolf Hitler was the best friend the Jews ever had in the Third Reich. And so this was an attempt on Irving's part to in some way whitewash the Führer's reputation. And that brought him into the orbit of hardcore Holocaust deniers. And the big problem, Holocaust deniers had been around since the 1960s. In France, in the early 70s, a man called Faurisson had been publishing books in which he denied the Holocaust. But the big problem the deniers had up to that time is that no historian had ever endorsed their position. And that's, of course, a problem. If you make a thesis about the revision of history and no historian,
there's no evidence,
and the historians don't take you seriously, then you remain an outsider. So Irving, who had a reputation as a historian, was a person who seemed to be like a fellow traveler. He said the Holocaust had happened, but Hitler didn't know about it, which meant it was in some way something which wasn't connected to the core of the Nazi state. It was like a traffic accident. It was a criminal act within the Nazi state, but it was not an act of the Nazi state. And so they started to woo Irving, and then in 1988, Irving publicly and officially joined their side during a trial in Toronto, which was a trial by a Holocaust denier named Ernst Zundel, and Irving was asked to come in as an expert witness on Zundel's side, and then during that trial basically endorsed a report written by another expert, Mr. Leuchter. Errol Morris made a movie about it, Mr. Death, and Mr. Leuchter had been to Auschwitz and he had written a forensic report on the camp in which he said that the gas chambers could not have worked and the crematoria could not have worked, hence there had been no gasings in Auschwitz, and as a result of it, of course, there had been no gasings at all, that the Holocaust was a myth. And Irving comes into that courtroom in April 1988 and he endorses the Leuchter report and he says, this is a document of world-shattering importance. I am now convinced on the basis of this forensic report that the Holocaust did not happen. So that was an important moment for the deniers because now they had a historian who had endorsed their position and they felt that now in some way the future was theirs.
They felt empowered. What happened with that trial in Toronto?
Now, Zundel was convicted. This is a very weird kind of old Canadian law, the law against spreading false news. The law dated from the War of 1810 or 11 when you guys invaded our country. And of course, people were creating rumors to help the invasion of the American troops over the Niagara River. And so this was, spreading false news was a crime in Canada. So afterwards, on appeal, this law was struck down as unconstitutional. So free speech finally came into Canada too, and Zundel was set free. What is the important after effect of this story is really what happens to Irving. Irving becomes the poster boy of Holocaust denial after he has made a statement in 1988. And in 1993, a scholar from now Emory University, Deborah Lipstadt, publishes a book on Holocaust denial.
Right.
And she identifies Irving as the most dangerous of Holocaust deniers. And it's not a reason because he's done so much original work on it, because he is a great theorist about it, but because he lent his reputation to it. He was the Holocaust denier who, so to speak, could get into people's living room. He had a reputation to lose. So she identifies him as the most dangerous, as a liar, a falsifier of history, a couple of charges he makes. And then in 1996, Irving decides to sue her in England.
For libel.
For libel. And the libel laws in England are kind of interesting. They're different from the United States. And the most important difference is that as a plaintiff, you can just basically make your complaint and sit back, because it's on the defendant, the person who has written the allegedly libelous text, to basically explain that the text was not libelous. In the United States, the plaintiff has to prove that the text was libelous. In England, the defendant has to prove that it was not libelous. So Lipstadt now had to defend herself and Penguin Books, and had to get a team together to prove that indeed whatever Irving, what had she said about Irving was true. And so the defense then decided to basically concentrate one of the aspects of the case on this issue of Irving's conversion to Holocaust denial, his official conversion in Toronto. And the question really became the following: would any professional historian or any kind of legitimate historian, any honest historian, have made that kind of statement he made in the courtroom, which is, indeed, there were no gas chambers in Auschwitz, or maybe there were gas chambers, they were not used to kill people, on the basis of the evidence Mr. Lorchter had presented in that courtroom? The assumption is that as a historian you have a public responsibility. And your public responsibility is that you look at evidence, you weigh evidence, there's always different kind of evidence, like you're a jury, and at a certain moment you come to a conclusion on the basis of a careful kind of analysis of the evidence. You know, for example, if a historian of the United States, the history of the United States, a person who has worked also on, let's say, the historian of on the history of the South, gets up tomorrow, and let's say this is a professor at a major university, gets up tomorrow and said slavery didn't exist, this would be an enormous public kind of issue. There would be an outcry. So as a historian you have a responsibility towards the past, and the past presents itself to you in the shape of evidence. So that became the issue. So I was called in as one of the 4 historians who became expert witnesses to actually look at this question of what is the evidence about Auschwitz? What is the evidence available to any historian in 1988? At the time that Irving was in that courtroom, evidence he should have considered before he actually made a judgment about the Lorchter report. And so it really became, the question became really about how do we do history? You know, what is the responsibility of a history? What is the vocation of the historian in some way? So my task became, first of all, what is the evidence? What is then also the value of that evidence? Because, of course, about something like Auschwitz, like with any historical event, there is solid evidence, and there's also evidence which is
testimonial evidence.
Testimonial evidence. There's the eyewitnesses.
Archives.
Sometimes eyewitnesses get confused. You know. So the idea was make first a collection of all the evidence there is, all the different classes of evidence, and then start looking at the evidence. And then once I had done that, so described basically the history of evidence about Auschwitz during the war, what did people know during the war, and after the war, what kind of forensic investigations were done by the Russians and the Poles in 1945 and 46, then go to the question, okay, how did Holocaust deniers up to 1988 deal with that evidence? Because Irving could have said, of course, I have read, books by Mr. Faurisson, and I've read books by Mr. Butts, Holocaust deniers, who had twisted and contorted the evidence. And so also, in some way, he should have asked himself the question, is what they do with the evidence legitimate, or should I have asked some very tough questions about it?
Exactly. And you came in with certain kind of evidence that you had studied throughout your research on Auschwitz. Tell me about what evidence you brought to the trial. There was a lot of different people that brought evidence, but you had specific tasks.
Yeah. In 1996, de Boer, who's professor of Holocaust history at Clark University and established their Center of Holocaust and Genocide Studies, the first in the United States, and I published a book which was entitled Auschwitz 1270 to the Present. That collaborative effort went back to work we started in the late 1980s, basically when the wall went down. And I was interested, as I told you at the beginning of this conversation, in the issue of the role of architects in Auschwitz.
Right.
And I first studied, in 1988, I went to Vienna to study the trial of two of the architects, who were, by the way, acquitted, Austrian justice here in 1970. And after that, I went to Auschwitz to study actually the blueprints of the crematoria and of the camp. By a miracle, all of that material survived, and survived half of it in Poland and half of it in the Soviet Union, and that material became available in 1991. The reason was very simple. The architecture office where they designed the camp was located around 500 yards from the camp itself. And so when in literally 60 years ago today, the SS withdrew from the camp and the Red Army was approaching, they burned everything, but the architecture office had been closed 3 months earlier because there was nothing to build anymore in the last months of the war.
Right.
And the architects had been drafted into the SS to fight the Russians. So the building was empty, there was no one there who could say, okay, there's also stuff in the basement here. So when the Red Army moved in, they found in the Kommandantur basically all the ashes of all the papers of the Kommandantur, but in the architecture office there were 300 boxes with blueprints, bills, architectural briefs, and so on. So in the history of the Holocaust and in the history of concentration camps, this is a unique collection. And so what the boardwork and I did in the early 90s was basically reconstruct the history of the camp through the lens of the construction. When prisoners arrive, barracks need to be built. When at a certain moment the SS decides that they want to kill people, massacre people on a large scale, they need to get crematoria, gas chambers, and so on. And so what we try to do is write this history and looking through the construction, but through the construction and then reconstruct the whole history of the camp. So this was the reason that in 1998, when I was asked to join the trial, I had a reputation in the field. That's why I could be an expert. Now, the reason why this is particularly important, the architectural evidence, is because the deniers love it. Why? Now, let's try to put ourselves in the position of a denier. How do you prove that something didn't happen? It's actually quite difficult. Because you cannot bring a witness forward who said this didn't happen. You cannot have a witness to a non-event. Witnesses are always to things that happen. Now, originally in the 1970s, they brought two people forward, a Mr. Steklich and a Mr. Christophersen in Germany, who both had served in Auschwitz. In the army had flak units, and they were basically anti-aircraft batteries in 1944. And they said, I was in Auschwitz, and I was there for a month or two, and I didn't see anything bad happening. It seemed to be a very cheerful.
That was enough.
That was for them enough, but still, you can argue. I mean, it was very clear. These guys, were not at the right place. They were not actually in Auschwitz-Birkenau where the killing took place. So the fact that they didn't see anything didn't mean that didn't happen.
Right.
It just happened behind their back.
Right.
So the problem, if we go back to what we call epistemological problem, the problem of what is evidence, deniers have a great problem with witnesses because they cannot bring forward witnesses who say it didn't happen because they don't really exist. So what they have to do is to say that all the witnesses who said it did happen, and there were 100,000 survivors of Auschwitz, are liars. And why are they lying? Now, the Jews are lying because they're Jews. The Germans who testified to their crimes, like Huss, Commandant Huss, they lied because they were afraid of being killed. You know, they said anything like in a show trial.
Because Hess came and said, yes, this happened.
Yeah, he wrote his memoirs.
He was very proud of it.
Yeah, like 300-page long memoirs. But they say that Huss wrote it in the same way as Bukhanin in the show trials in Stalinist Russia confessed all kinds of crimes he had never committed. You know, they basically said it's a show trial. So, once you remove all the eyewitnesses as legitimate evidence, then the question is what remains. Now, what remains in the case of Auschwitz are these architectural plans, and of course the ruins. So now what they try to, and they cannot protest. You can. This is what they call, material. This is non-intentional evidence. We call it in history. It was not created in order to be evidence.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
The Germans created it in order to build a camp, and you can, of course, turn it around the way you want it. You can reinterpret it. You can turn the evidence against itself. And so that's what they have been doing. So they try first, they would go, for example, to these blueprints, which I've been working on with Deborah, and they said, okay, we look now in the basement of Crematorium 2. People allege there was a gas chamber, but the spaces in that blueprint are not called gas chamber, they're called morgue. So obviously there were no gas chambers there. So then, of course, we have to do some explanation to say, yes, originally these were intended to be morgues. They became gas chambers afterwards, but didn't make a new set of drawings. Okay, so that's one thing. The second thing is they started to say is, okay, there in the plants there are these ovens, but these ovens they only could have incinerated over the history of a camp 100,000 people instead of 1 million people. So you have to go now into oven technology. Why is it that the Auschwitz ovens could actually have incinerated so many more people? And one of the reasons is because you have many corpses being incinerated at the same time.
Right.
And of course many of the victims were children. They were small. Then we go to the next thing. They are going to the ruins, and that was what Mr. Leuchter had done, and they start to take samples from the wall. So they go to a space which is a gas chamber, allegedly, they say, an alleged gas chamber, and they take some samples and they see if there's any cyanide in the wall. Now, when you go to Auschwitz and there are gas chambers where clothing were deloused, you find big blue spots on the wall.
Right.
So if you take a sample from that, the blue is actually a cyanide compound, ferrocyanide. So you put that in a laboratory tube, and then there comes like 5,000 parts per million of cyanide. So then they go to a homicidal gas chamber, and they take a sample, and there's virtually no cyanide in the wall. There's no blue coloring. So they said, there's a proof. There was no gassing in there. The question which they didn't ask at the time, and which we had to ask in the trial, is why is there no cyanide in that wall? Now, the answer is, chemically kind of complex, but after a long story, it is basically because the ferrocyanide will not form if there's a lot of carbon dioxide available in that space. And carbon dioxide, of course, will be there in a high concentration when there are people in that gas chamber. So that's why you will not get that blue coloring in a homicidal gas chamber.
So you use less than more.
Yes, yeah.
And they use Zyklon, it's called Zyklor B?
Zyklon B, that was the cyanide.
That was used to kill.
Yeah.
Could you explain real quickly what the process was? I understand they would arrive at the camp and they would take him directly to the gas chambers. Explain the process, because to understand the trial, you have to understand how they were exterminated.
People arrived in Auschwitz, and typically this transport of Jews would be subjected to a selection. And in the selection, children, mothers with children, and older people would immediately be sent to the gas chambers, and people who could still work would be admitted into the camp, tattooed, and they would be used as slave labor until they were finished, and they would also be sent to the gas chamber. Now, the gas chambers themselves were in buildings called crematoria. And there were two different kind of models in Birkenau, Auschwitz-Birkenau, but I will just talk about one. This was a building you could see at the end of the train track, so people who arrived could see those two buildings, Crematorium 2 and Crematorium 3, and they looked like
normal buildings,
relatively normal buildings, like German architecture, kind of Heimatstil. They would go to that building, they would go into a separate compound surrounded by barbed wire, And then they basically would descend into a basement. And the first basement in which they descended is a basement which was originally planned as a morgue, but now it was used as an undressing room. So there were hooks on the wall and there were benches and you had to undress, and they basically told you, hang your clothing on your hook, remember the number because you will come back here, tie your shoes together.
They were lied to. So
they were lied to.
Right.
And then they would be brought, and this would be, up to 2,000 people in that one room, and then they would be brought or driven, if they protested, into a second basement, and that second basement was the gas chamber. And people would be let in the gas chamber, the door would be closed, and then the gas would be introduced through kind of hollow columns from above, because these gas chambers were, basically sticking from under the building, so there were holes in the roof.
Holes where you drop the poison gas.
The gas came as a kind of granular substance, so there were tins of it, and they would simply open the tin and drop the contents of the tin inside that column, and then the gas would evaporate from this granular substance. That was what Zyklon really was.
Did any Gentiles die in Auschwitz?
Oh yes, up to 1 million Jews died, mostly in the gas chambers, and around 100,000 Gentiles died in Auschwitz.
Same way,
Poles.
or were they killed differently?
It was quite unusual for Poles who arrived in Auschwitz, mostly arrived as political prisoners. Very few Polish children arrived, only late in 1944 after the Warsaw uprising of the city of Warsaw. So you didn't really have those children and old people arriving who would be subjected to a selection. So people died there in gas chambers as a result of a selection in the camp.
I'm going to ask you one last question. Give me the 3 main reasons why you won the trial.
I think it's maybe one main reason. I mean, and that is because ultimately the evidence is there. There is such an overwhelming evidence for Auschwitz. And when we started the trial, we were talking to the lawyers, and Richard Rampton, the Queen's Counsel, basically told me, this is the first and last case I will have in my life we simply cannot lose. And I said, why can't we lose this case? Every case can be lost. And he said, because we have the evidence. And so I think that's a very simple answer. Holocaust deniers don't have the evidence. That's the problem they have. They have all kinds of theories, but ultimately, if you don't have the evidence, you don't have history.
In any case, we won this case very big, and one of the key issues in the trial was actually the evidence about Auschwitz, because Irving was a historian who had converted to Holocaust denial on the basis of a forensic report on Auschwitz. And so there are many headlines the next day, but this is the 12th of April, but Auschwitz was very central in this case, also emotionally became the center point of the case, because when you deny the Holocaust in general, it's abstract, but Auschwitz is not. So I wrote this book, it was published in 2002, and it's around 550 pages long. Indeed, it's quite a densely written book. And I thought when I wrote the book, that's the last of it. I mean, maybe I'll have some more lectures, but this book will stand as my record of my involvement and about the record of the evidence we have, mainly architectural, for the genocidal use of the Auschwitz crematorium.
And so here we have a model of crematorium number 3. This is one of the 4 gas chamber equipped crematoria. It consisted of an underground undressing room with the victims entering at the far end. This was a very large room. It was over 250 square meters large. Once the victims were undressed, they were herded into an underground gas chamber. The underground gas chambers had gas columns through which the gas was introduced in this space. And after everyone was killed, their corpses were brought into a little elevator which brought the corpses up to the main floor, and there were 15 ovens in 5 triple arrangement that could incinerate the corpses in 24 hours. Now, what Holocaust deniers say is that these buildings were not really killing machines, that yes, there are a lot of ovens, but that these ovens had the capacity, the alleged capacity, they say they had, of 1,500 corpses per day to deal with the victims of typhus epidemics. The gas column became, in the trial, the key piece of evidence that was challenged by Irving. What were these gas columns? The gas came in tins. The tins were commercially available tins of delousing agency called Zyklon or Cyclone. Now, when the Germans started using this product, this toxin, on human beings, they discovered very quickly that when people were exposed to a concentration of around 300 parts per million, they would die within 5-10 minutes. However, the degassing of the cyanide would continue for another 23.5 hours. This was not a problem when you were involved in occasional killing, let's say every week or so. But when trains started arriving on a 24-hour basis at Auschwitz, and the Germans wanted to kill people on a 24-hour cycle in which within 24 hours people arrive, are selected, brought to the undressing room, into the gas chamber, killed, and then their corpses are being incinerated before the next transport arrives. The continuous degassing of the pallets of Cyclone was a real problem. So this is why they created this gas column. So this gas column has the purpose not so much of introducing the gas, introducing the Zyklon into the space, but even more importantly, to take it out after 15 minutes, so that this 24-hour cycle of killing and incineration could be maintained. Then, after that, the ventilators could be turned on, and the Sonderkommandos, the slave workers who had to clean the gas chamber, would, after 10-15 minutes, be able to enter the gas chamber and start the gruesome work of removing the corpses, retrieving dental gold, and so on, and then bring them up to the incinerators. Now, Holocaust deniers, and also Irving, have made the existence or non-existence of the columns in some way the key to their argument. They say, no holes, no Holocaust. And the holes they're referring to are the holes that existed in the concrete roof of the gas chamber through which the central column connected to the outside world. When the SS left Auschwitz in January 1945, they dynamited the gas chambers. And this meant that the roof collapsed on the floor of the gas chamber. And we were, in the trial, able to prove to the satisfaction of the judge that indeed these holes had existed, these purposely made holes had existed in the ruined slab of that covered the gas chamber. One of the pieces we see in this room is a door, a gas door. This door basically has two sides. This is the place that we call it the perpetrator side. And we see here two latches that are used to close the door when the gas chamber will be brought in operation, to close the door after all the victims have been brought in. One of the latches moves, can be closed, and this is the last thing that 2,000 people would have heard before the gas would be introduced. Now, Holocaust deniers say that this gas door actually had not a genocidal function, that air raid shelters have gas doors, because during an air raid one could also have all kinds of toxic gases that are being produced by the bombing, and so a normal piece of equipment in an air raid shelter is a gas-tight door. Now, why is this not a door for an air raid shelter? First of all, the question is, if you walk into this space that is protected by the door, you wouldn't want to be inside with somebody on the outside being able to close the door like this, and you would have no means from the inside to open the door again. You are going to be locked in. Always somebody on the outside will have to open the latches to allow the door to open again. But when we go to the other side of the door, and we look now at the door as it would be from the inside, we see also that for an air raid shelter, this door would really not have worked. The first thing which is very clear is that there is no hint, that there's no way on the inside to actually manipulate this door. There's no way to open it. There's no handle. So once you're inside and somebody has closed the door on the outside, you're locked in. This we call the victim's side of the door. People were pushed in this room, 10 people per square meter, and when the gas was introduced, a panic would happen. The panic was such that we have eyewitness reports that the victims tried to break the glass of the peephole. That was the only agency they still had left in this panic. And therefore the Germans created this protective half sphere made out of steel over the peephole. And in some way it is this protective device that in some way gives an indication of the terrible conditions that were inside that gas chamber. If the only thing that you can still do is try to break the glass in that peephole as the gas enters, it really means that you have no agency, no options whatsoever. After a trial that lasted 33 days in court, Irving was declared the loser by the judge. This case was very important because for the first time, both Holocaust denial and the theories that support Holocaust denial, as well as the evidence, in this case for the killings in Auschwitz, had been subjected to a judicial review. And a judge who presided over the case without a jury had come to the conclusion that the Holocaust indeed had taken place and that the key place in the Holocaust, Auschwitz, had been an extermination camp in which more than 1 million people had been killed in gas chambers.
So this photo is key in the history of the trial, because this is a photo before the crematorium tomb is completed, and you see the gas chamber there before actually it was covered with dirt. And what is very important here is that you actually see the top of the gas columns sticking out. We don't have any other photo. And what's also important is that we can date this photo because of the little bit of soot that's on the top of the chimney, which means it was taken after the first trial run of the ovens. And the dating of this photo became very important in the trial because Irving was arguing that what's on top of that gas chamber were not these tops of the gas columns, but basically vessels with tar to tar the roof. But since we could date this drawing, they hadn't yet started tarring the roof. So these are the kind of arguments we had to deal with in the trial. So probably the most important photo we have of the extermination installation inside the most lethal of crematoria. And in this crematorium, probably around 500,000 people were killed in that one room. Yeah, so it's the most lethal place on Earth. This is a very important drawing. It's a tiny little sketch by a 15-year-old boy who actually saw the gas columns in the gas chamber, and he drew it immediately after the war. And there's a long story how he got into the gas chamber when it was empty in the middle of the winter too warm. But this is one of the pieces of evidence we have about the gas columns. There are only a couple of drawings made immediately after the war by survivors. Of course, the gas columns were seen by 500,000 people, and of those 500,000 people who saw the gas columns, maybe 700 if you take crematorium 3 into account, only maybe 40 lived to tell what they've seen. So these are very charged documents also. Also confessions. These are the confessions by the commandant of Auschwitz, Rudolf Höss, who after the war wrote his memoirs. Sorry. A section through the gas chamber, what becomes the gas chamber. There's the ventilation channels you see above and below. The scene of killings at a fire pit, as remembered in 45 or 46 by a survivor named David Olaire, who was one of the slave workers in the crematorium. Very central piece of evidence, for example, is the fact that we can trace the way the doors are hung. This is a morgue that becomes a gas chamber. And the change, one of the major changes in adapting this space from a morgue into a gas chamber is that the doors that originally opened inwards now open outwards after the transformation.
Of course, it begins with the evidence we've got, pictures and plans and testimonies.
Yeah, so these are two images. This is an image of gas hatches. These were basically 30 by 40 centimeter large openings that could be closed with these gas-compatible doors. We found this in a little room at the back of a crematorium full of garbage. But these are pieces of evidence that were rotting there. And so, and the reason this was important in the trial was that we have all kind of convergent evidence about the function of these things. We have a letter that says we need to order gas-tight hatches 30 by 40 centimeters. These are 30 by 40 centimeters. We have a blueprint that shows the 30 by 40 centimeters at just below the eave of the gas chambers. And we have eyewitness evidence talking about the SS climbing on a ladder to open these things to throw the poison crystals into those rooms. So it's all about convergent evidence. None of these things by itself says anything, but they say something together.